But not once was I able in that time to try to understand where he was coming from. All I was trying to do was respond with love. And I thought that responding with love was the best I could do.
That is Pierre Powell, the guest for today's episode. In this inaugural episode, you'll hear Pierre share two stories, both from the time when he was in the U.S. Air Force. The first story explores shame. The second explores issues of race, neither of which are easy topics to explore. So I hope you'll join me in holding space for Pierre to reflect honestly. Welcome to the journey of realizing empathy. I think we all have experienced the moment in our lives when we suddenly empathize with somebody we previously did not, by experiencing a moment of realization. One where we went, aha, oh, or maybe even burst out with laughter concerning something we either did not or had incorrectly assumed to understand and appreciate enough. While these realizations can sometimes be had in a few minutes, it can also take years. In fact, it may never happen. It is a seemingly simple yet complex and lifelong process of realizing empathy that I wish to explore in all of our episodes. Hey there, listener. My name is Slim. I help startup founders in their maturation as a leader and a CEO by helping them confront themselves in a true mirror. And I believe few things serve as a truer mirror than the challenges we face in our interactions with other people. The Journey of Realizing Empathy is a show where we explore how our challenges with other people can ultimately serve as a true mirror that helps us mature as leaders and human beings. In each of our episodes, we host a guest who tells a story of a time in their life when they struggled to empathize with one or more people until a series of realizations moved them to empathize with those very people. Welcome, Pierre.
Hello, how are you?
Would you be willing to briefly introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Well, like you, and I'm doing some leadership coaching and consulting. I work for my family primarily. But before all of that, I was a colonel in the Air Force, and I flew jets, single-seat fighter pilot. So, of course, my stories often come from, when I think about or challenge of empathy, they come from that arena.
Got it. So we'll be talking about your experience in the military, is that right?
Yes.
Excellent. And before we begin, I want to make sure that I start by acknowledging how much I personally appreciate you for being on the show. We live in a climate where empathy has become kind of a buzzword. It's constantly in the media. And instead of talking about how much empathy we have, which is a way of promoting ourselves, to talk about times in which we were challenged to empathize, I think can be very difficult in a climate like the one we're currently in. So I genuinely appreciate you for coming on the show. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So let's roll back the clock, as people would say, to the point where you believe would be a great place to start for you to tell the story.
I have, I think, two military stories. Are not really around the military activity, but one's when I was a little older, which I think is the one I'm going to start with. And in a long story, I ended up working at the Pentagon for the Secretary of the Air Force. The Secretary of the Air Force had an action group of about 8 or 9 people. We all had jobs. I was a lieutenant colonel.
For people who don't know, can you explain a little bit what secretary is?
So, of course, in our Constitution, the military always has to report to a civilian so that we don't or something to that effect. So whoever is the president in the executive branch chooses the Secretary of Defense, and then he, with the president, then chooses a civilian to run each of the services. So they may come from a related aerospace as far as the Air Force, maybe an aerospace company or somebody that has a lot of experience in the aerospace world or something of that. In the case of my situation, our secretary at the time, Mr. Peters, was a civilian who Bill Clinton had assigned as the assistant secretary. And then Sheila Wildenhall, I think, came from Lockheed as a scientist. And she ended up leaving, and then he became the secretary about the time I came to work for him.
Okay. Okay.
So he was a civilian, came from outside of the military to oversee the military. And so then each military branch has somebody called a chief of staff, who is the person of the highest rank in the military. And that person runs the day-to-day operations of the military. The secretary then has the political responsibility. And there obviously huge tension between a person that has grown up, spent 30 to 35 years in the military to become the highest ranking military person, but he still has to report to this
civilian,
appointed civilian who may not have any experience in the military at all.
Oh, wow. That's interesting dynamic. I did not know about that. Okay.
So in our case, our secretary had a group of, because he was not military experienced, he had a group of us, 8 to 10, that provided him insights to meetings and other, activities that would happen so that we could prep him to be ready for a military-oriented discussion. My role was I was actually in charge of information technology, believe it or not, for the military. I was also in charge of operations, and I was also responsible for the Guard and Reserve. So whenever he had a meeting on one of those topics, I would review the meeting packets ahead of time and provide him a preparatory information so that he could be ready for those meetings.
Wow. So you're in a supporting role to the secretary.
Right, just completely supporting him. And the strange thing is, because I was working for the secretary, I was slightly outside of the main military structure.
Okay, so there's the secretary, you're supporting the secretary, and there's the chief of staff person who is really like a military person who is reporting to the secretary. And what else is there?
And the entire Air Force basically falls under the chief of staff.
Got it.
All, in this case, 750,000 worldwide, and all of the operations and activities that go on with that.
Wow.
Anyway, so there's the way this story goes, just to make references, I was a fighter pilot. And at the time, and although the Air Force is evolving today, the fighter pilot was considered the pinnacle role in the Air Force. It was the Air Force, and we made that. And it was something that I always wanted to be, was to be a pilot. In my case, I flew the F-15, which was a single-seat airplane. It was highly esteemed airplane. So I'm pretty proud of myself.
Oh, of course, of course.
During this time, you're on a staff tour, so you're not flying. So I worked at the Pentagon, and you constantly roll from a flying job to a staff job to a flying job to a staff job.
Huh, okay.
And one of the people in the action group was the secretary's speechwriter. This speechwriter we'll call Chris. Chris sat next to me, and we had a lot of fun together. He wrote, the secretary obviously is the political manifestation of the Air Force, so he gave a lot of speeches. I got to go with him to the Air Force Academy when he gave the commencement address, these kind of things around. He would be the first person to connect to Congress. And so Chris was responsible for preparing the secretary. And because the secretary did not have a lot of Air Force experience, I would provide Chris a lot of the talking points that would need to go into the speeches. And we became fairly close, and we were pretty good friends, and a lot of laughing and joking. And in fact, even the Air Force created some core values while we were there. And so the core values were integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. So we even changed the wording of that in the secretary's speeches because we didn't like it quite as much. Here we are, 2 lieutenant colonels, low down, so to speak, but we were influencing policy and perspective.
Wow.
Anyway, so one day we get a call that there's a meeting of congressional staffers to talk about some Air Force issues. So they want an expert to go over and talk to them. And the secretary called me and said he wants me to go to speak to these staffers. And when we go, we always wear our blues. And our blues have all of the names and our rank. It's a formal uniform. And when I went to my closet to get the blues out, I realized that I had them at the dry cleaner.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't have my uniform, and I probably should have had an alternate uniform to go. I wasn't expecting to have that meeting. And so I told Chris, I'm like, what am I going to do? And he said, well, just wear my coat.
Oh.
Okay, so I had my name tag. I put my name tag. I grabbed his coat. We were both lieutenant colonels. I went off to this meeting. And we were talking about various issues with the staffers, but at the end, there was a lunch. We're all standing around, and a staffer looks at me and he says, "What's that badge on your uniform?" But when he put it, instead of my wings that represent the fact that I'm a pilot, I had a different badge on because it wasn't Chris's coat. And it's an air traffic control badge because he entered the Air Force as an air traffic controller. And I looked down, and knowing that, I said, "Well, it's my air traffic control badge." Now, knowing that I can't be an F-15 fighter pilot, I have to be an air traffic controller. And so then the staffer looks at me and he makes this obnoxious face at me and he goes, "What are you going to do today? Are you just going to like control the room, move people around the room?" And I'm kind of disgusted. I'm like, "Yeah, whatever."
I mean, is this like a typical banter that happens, or there was more to this?
It hadn't happened to me like that, because if I had said, "Oh, those are my command wings," and he said, "Oh, what did you fly?" and I say F-15s, you probably would have asked for some type of story, or he would have, it's like you meet a SEAL or you meet somebody and you're like, "Oh, wow." And I would have
gotten a cocktail party thing.
Right. It would have been a completely different reception than air traffic controller. "Oh, right. Now I'm going to make fun of you."
Sure.
So it was like the first time I had felt, I don't know, maybe we say military discrimination. I didn't really realize that this stuff was going on.
Right.
I had been in an esteemed position or an esteemed way. So I come back to our room and everybody says, "Hey, how'd it go?" And I tell that story.
To Chris?
And Chris is standing there and everybody is standing there. And I say, "Yeah." And then he's like, "Hey, what are you going to do? Control me around the room?" I said, "Can you believe that?" I said, "I've never felt discrimination like this." And I think that's what I said. And I hung up Chris's coat and put it back in the closet or whatever. And I come in the next day and Chris sits next to me, and no greeting, no hello, no how are you. And I can tell he's mad at me. Not only is he mad at me, he's leaking anger outside. He's so mad at me. And I said, "Hey, what's up? What's going on?" I can obviously tell that he was mad at me, and I tried to break down that barrier, and nothing. This goes on for 3 or 4 days. There's another speechwriter. I talked to the other speechwriter. "What do you think's going on?" He says, "I think Chris is just very upset with you and representing his career field or whatever like that." I'm like, "So, hey," I talked to Chris. I'm like, "Hey, Chris, I'm really sorry. I certainly didn't mean to represent you bad. I was just telling you the story of what happened to me." Nothing. So anyway, this starts to go on a week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 weeks. And I am just like, I'm just feeling, I don't know how to move forward. And at the time, I had just gone through a Christian weekend program. And I said, the least what I'll do is I'll just try to love him. I said, I don't know how to connect with him, but every time I see him, I'll try to think about love so that at least what's reflecting out of it is not. So I started that. And then we would be in a meeting with our boss, who is a colonel, who was the direct report to the secretary. And she would ask me a question. If I answered the question, he would counteract the answer. So this went on 3-4 weeks. And then I remember we were in a meeting with the Secretary of the Air Force over a visit and a speech that he was giving. And the secretary looked at me, and it was an operational question, and asked me what I recommended. And I said something, and Chris actually said, "Sir, that is the last thing I would ever do. What I would do." And even my boss, the colonel, I think even took him aside and said, "Hey, let's not counteract each other in front of the secretary. We can talk about these things later." But anyway, it just went on. And surprisingly, Chris ended up getting a new job. I don't know the background to why. And he left.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
He got a new job somewhere else in the world. Actually, I think he went to Korea so he had left the air traffic control, became a communication specialist, and I think he was responsible for Air Force communications out of Korea coming out of it. So it was a promotion. But there was no goodbye. There was no movement. And I just, and the only response I knew what to do was just to try to, like I said, hold this love for him. And ended up getting promoted to be the deputy of the action group coming out of that, which was surprising too. But I think part of it was because I wasn't responding negatively to Chris, because everybody could see the tension. But I still necessarily wasn't connecting to Chris. Well, I don't know, about 3 or 4 months later, he came back to the Pentagon for a visitor. He had some meeting at the Pentagon, and he called me and asked me if I would go to lunch with him.
Oh, wow.
So I went to lunch, a little Vietnamese place just outside of the Pentagon. And we sat down, and I just remember they delivered our full bowl, and he just started crying. And he went on, it was 5-10 minutes. You see this 2 lieutenant colonels sitting at this table, and one of them is sobbing. And then he went into what was going on. And he told me for the first time, and I had no knowledge of it because I hadn't inquired, was that he had wanted to be a pilot, and he had imagined being a pilot his whole life. Actually, I'm getting a little bit sad right now. I haven't told the story in a while. But that was his dream, was to join the Air Force and fly airplanes. And he went to pilot training, and he wasn't able to overcome air sickness, so he washed out. So when they asked him what he wanted to do, he said, I just want to be as close to pilots as possible. So I want to be an air traffic controller. So it was that was the first moment where I understood and had a connecting conversation with him to understand this pain that I had pulled forward and what he had probably been experiencing for the last 18 to 20 years of his time in the military. And then, of course, I think what was even more interesting was, as I was preparing for this and listened to your video, I realized that I hadn't really, even to this point, truly experienced the empathy of understanding the pain that he must have gone through, and that I brought forward, and that I represented every day while he was sitting in that office. So I think that's the case that I wanted to bring forward.
Wow. I'm a little emotional too.
Yeah. As a side, the beauty, right, of having a connecting conversation is we connected probably for the first time over that Vietnamese lunch. And then he went on. So 2001 and 2007, that was in 2000. In 2007, I was the vice commander of air forces in Afghanistan. And I was responsible for or deputy, responsible for about 4,500 people in various locations. And then the headquarters had a joint headquarters, and there were some challenges going on there. And when I went down to investigate, who was there but Colonel Chris, who had been promoted up and was working in Kabul for the joint forces, not for the Air Force. And we got together, and it was like we hadn't seen, we were brothers. We hadn't seen each other in a long time. The funny part was I was still apologizing. I remember as I was talking, I'm like, Chris, I just can't believe how bad, I still feel so bad about it. He's like, come on, I'm over it. Let's move. So I think it was really, there's another piece of it that kind of goes along with things that you've been talking about or professing or moving forward around that as well.
Yeah, there's just so much embedded in that moment when he was willing to be honest about his original dreams. I can only imagine how complicated that can be. Who knows what kind of family background one grows up in, and if they have from a very young age set their dreams to go that direction, then coming to terms with that, I think, in a very honest way, through a painful yet maybe in some ways healing way, I would imagine at the same time. Does that resonate with you?
Well, a couple pieces. One, I wasn't equipped at the time to truly understand, did he go through a healing experience there? Obviously, I opened the wound. So
right.
That the wound would, and I would say by the time we were in Afghanistan, that was no longer, it felt like he had gotten beyond that. But the depth of that issue even today, maybe not quite as much now in 2020, but back then, if you weren't a pilot, the chances of your promotion opportunities were very low beyond.
Oh.
So when he washed out of training, he had to be exceptional to be promoted to a general officer or to be promoted beyond that. Well, I think in fairness, as a pilot, I had more opportunity and more availability. And I remember he lived downtown Washington, D.C., in the downtown D.C. area, and he spent all his time reading biographies, being very political savvy. He read all of the newspapers. Of course, he's a speechwriter and he's a communicator, so these things that he enjoys. But he was so equipped to be successful as a political leader, potentially. And I was not. I didn't have that same level of even interest or excitement in those things. So again, somebody that's so capable, but because of that little expectation that if you're not a pilot, you're not going to get. I think you're opening up all of these things. Of course, there was nobody else in that office that could have cut as cleanly as I had done myself, coming from my background.
So when you look back at that time, how long ago was this? Like
20 years? That was year 2000. So surprisingly, 20 years. It resonated. I mean, in the TED Talk that I saw where you had tried to relate with this other person, but until that you could tell it wasn't your story, it was being able to hear them. So I spent 5-6 months with, let's call him Mean Chris, because he was so, this is the right word. But not once was I able in that time to try to understand where he was coming from. All I was trying to do was respond with love. And I thought that responding with love was the best I could do. But the reality is, I think it was what he and it didn't quell the anger, right? Because he wasn't heard, he wasn't known, or he wasn't seen in that event.
Yeah, and it was probably also difficult for him to even come up with the right words to talk about this, because there's so many complex emotions and past histories welded in together. And it sounds like it took him a while before that Vietnamese dinner lunch, where he finally could grasp those words and was able to process in a way that you both really felt it. I'm just glad that there was that Vietnamese lunch.
I was too, and I look back upon it, and I always thought to myself, this is how this is Pierre's empathy challenge. I always thought that it was by just loving him unconditionally that everything worked out. And it probably did have a play into it.
Sure.
But when we look at it, it was really him that entered vulnerably or authentically at the end and was able to share what he was going through. I was never ready or equipped to do that. I was ready to receive. I was able to hear him, and I didn't try to,
But.
solve it. But I think even this is where I've just been processing in the last day or two as I've been thinking about this over and over again, is I thought it was me, but it wasn't. It was him. It was his ability to open up that we were able to make progress and move forward.
Right. Isn't that so interesting? I think when we hear the word empathy, the popular association that we probably make is it's all about the other. Right. But then the way we interpret the notion that it's all about the other is, how can we make other people feel better? What can I do? All the things that we can say or gesture, or what you were saying, like apologize. These are obviously very useful and meaningful and valuable things. But at the same time, there are situations in which ultimately the other person has to feel heard and understood and appreciated for who they are. And in some ways, the power of the eventual space that was created between you and Chris was in some ways neither about him nor about you, but just perfectly in between, where without you, in some ways, maybe he may not have had an opportunity to confess this to, right? He must have felt sufficiently safe with you, despite the anger and all the other emotions that he needed some time to process. If it weren't for you, he may not have had anybody else to whom to confess this. So there's something very fascinating when I hear your story about this in-between space between you and him, where it's neither about just the other person, nor it's about just you, but it's this relationship that's just so precious and wonderful. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. I think a couple pieces of that. The first part was he was still hanging in there in the Air Force, wanting to be connected to the Air Force. He still had this leftover childhood dream or whatever that kept him there. His skill set was so beyond just what we were doing in the service. And he did capitalize and get promoted to colonel. And I don't know if he went beyond that. I haven't kept up with him. The other part is that growing up, I had a lot of personal insecurities. And actually, when I think of fighter pilots, or a lot of the fighter pilots I know, they have a very similar story right there. I don't know, overcompensate or to show their value by doing something that is kind of an extreme. I think there's a lot of that. And so even up to that point, my focus was very much on myself and my success and my continuing to be the absolute best military officer and pilot I could be so that I could continue to have success and rise in the Air Force. And all of a sudden, and I think that was the part that when the staffer said, are you going to control us around the room, that I woke up a little bit. The fact that there is almost like a caste system or separate levels of how people are perceived that are in the Air Force. Yet we're all contributing to the mission and all have our role and part. So there was like a little momentary wake up of my own recognition of maybe some of the other parts. Yeah.
So what was the other story that you had about a challenge of empathy related to this sort of ranks?
The other story I had was more, it surprisingly is similar, but different. It has a little bit of a racial piece to it. I was a captain in a training organization flying jets, and I had been picked to go to what's called Squadron Officer School. The military has a lot of training. Like I told you, they sent me to Harvard when I was a colonel. But when you're a captain, you go to this 8-week program called Squadron Officer School, where you just really learn about the rest of the service outside of you. So you're deep in training, and I was deep in training, and I got selected to go to the school, and another guy got selected to go to the school. His name was Cedric. He was a really tall black man who was a maintenance officer. Cedric is probably one of the best people I've ever met. We didn't know each other at that point, but they said we're going together. We were in New Mexico, Squadron Officer Schools in Alabama. So we decided to drive 2 cars, but caravan. And you got to know each other. We stopped, spent the night in Dallas, had some dinner. And this guy, he is just one of the best leaders I've ever known in my life. But anyways, we were driving through Mississippi, and we were taking some back roads to get to where we were in Alabama. And I needed gas. So we had one. We didn't have cell phones. So I'm pulling over for some gas. And so I pulled into this gas station. And as I started pumping, I looked over and the door opened and 6 black men came out of the door, and there was nobody else out there. We're in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, and they start to approach me. And I'm like, this is scary because I'm in a part of Mississippi that I didn't really appreciate or understand. And this is 1994. And all of a sudden, Cedric drives up in his car, and he's a big guy. He gets out of the car and he comes up and he puts his arm around me and he goes, "How are things going?" I'm like, "They're going good." And he looks over at the guys. He goes, "Is there a problem here?" And they're like, they look at him, look at me, and they go, "No problem." And they turned and walked back in. So thanks. But anyway, we go to Squadron Officer School, we're divided into 51 different flights, so I don't see him very much. One of the last days, he ends up, we have to play sports and all this funny stuff, while you're there, and he ends up twisting his right ankle. Volleyball. And so we drive home together, and he's driving with his right foot in his passenger seat, and his left foot is driving the car.
Wow.
And every couple hours we have to stop. I have to get him another bag of ice. so we can get home. Anyway, like I said, one of the people I respect the most in the world, I'm just an outstanding guy. So we get back to base. I get promoted to become a functional check pilot, which is fun because I take airplanes that have just had some major maintenance and I get to go take it out and check the airplane.
Yeah.
Included things like a mock run, shutting down engines. No, there's no student in the airplane, so it's super fun.
Wow.
Take off the runway, and our maintenance officer that's part of the functional check pilot program quits.
Oh.
For whatever reason, he gets another job. I don't know. So we're walking in, and I turn to the guy that's in charge of the functional check pipe program, and I say, how about Cedric? He's a great guy. I know he's a maintenance officer. He was on the F-117, which was the stealth fighter. I said, I bet he would do a great job. And we walked into the bathroom. That's what I said as we walked into the bathroom, because we had just come back from a flight. As we were standing at the urinals, he turns to me and he goes, I can't stand that guy. That guy is one of the people that I know. He is blah, blah, blah. Frankly, it was all racist. And he said my name a couple of times while we were standing there. And I just kind of took it in. I didn't know what to say, but surprised because I didn't understand the racism. And so I walked to my office, and I was sitting in my office. About 2 minutes later, Cedric shows up. We're on the different side of the base. I don't know what he's doing over there. I'm like, hey, Cedric, how are you doing? He goes, I was doing okay, but I just happened to be in the bathroom. And
wow.
I heard you and so-and-so talking about me, and what you guys said wasn't too flattering. And I said, I didn't say anything. He goes, that's the point. And he walked out, got in his car, and drove off. And I didn't see him for another 10, 12 years coming out of that situation. I didn't go apologize to him. I didn't go try to understand the situation. This is a good friend of mine. The follow-on to the story is I was taking up one of these coaching programs 5, 6 years ago. They asked if I had any communication things that were unresolved. And I brought up the story. Now, Cedric, as a maintenance guy, was a 2-star general at this point. So he had a very successful career outside of the flying world. And I sent him a note. And I outlined that whole thing, how it had been on my heart for 15 years, how terrible I felt about what had happened. And he sent me a response that was like, I don't even remember any of that. I love it, man. And truthfully, I don't think that was true. I'm sure that he had remembered it. But it still is, we were talking about kind of an empathy as I was reflecting over this discussion, was like the ability, especially with racial injustice and the challenges that are going on within the United States. I didn't feel that I was racist to Cedric, or at least but I certainly wasn't anti-racist. I certainly didn't stand up when I had the opportunity to do that. And talk about a wound for somebody that has really stood up, joined the military. You're supposed to be in an organization that values people based on what they do. To see somebody that's a friend of mine, Cedric, from a point of race, and me not really standing up to what I knew to be true, to allow that moment to pass, was another one of those that, again, reflecting over the last few days and thinking of that story, and then understanding how non-empathetic I was to Cedric.
I have a different appreciation of why you shared the gas station story earlier. In some ways, I think you're trying to point out that he did stand up for you.
Yeah.
And you feel like you hadn't. And there is probably a kind of an emotional regret, so to speak, when you put those two stories side by side. Is that why you shared the story?
Well, no. But now that you bring it together, it probably was. What I was trying to say is how he cared about me. I didn't even see that. I understood the race issue going there, but I did not understand how he had stood up for me as a white man in an area that was probably not a place at that time of safety. And yet he had exposed his whole life to being in an unsafe environment, especially around his race. And then, like I said, he's one of the most fantastic people that I know. I mean, that I had known. And I have to be careful being that this is live streamed. I mean, his call sign, so we all get call signs. My call sign was Lucky. And that isn't necessarily because I was lucky. It's a joke, because there's always an underlying negativity that goes with call signs. I love the name, but that joke had to do something around homosexuality in the military. So, because there's an old joke about Lucky Pierre, and because my name was Pierre, they made that joke, and you just accepted at the time. At that time, a very homophobic military. Cedric's call sign was Curious. It's based on Curious George. When I look back on that, and then I think of racial injustice. Of course, he proudly has used that call sign his entire career and is a 2-star general. But at the same time, there's still an underpinning of inappropriateness. The fact that he was willing to wear that badge. Even that, I actually feel compelled after our conversation to call him. I'd love to just talk to him.
Yeah, and you're able to find ways to contact him at this point as well?
I'm sure I can. I think LinkedIn or whatever, I'll find his address. And
wow.
Yeah.
I think that would be very meaningful. I mean, I'm just so moved by the fact that both of the stories, I think the way in which you approach the story really strikes me. Right? Because to me, it comes from a place where there is this balance of humility and courage. There's often this sort of unease with the notion of humility. There's a bit of an embarrassment. There's a bit of an humiliation associated with it. But then the flip side of that is, unless you approach something with humility, the chance of you learning something new goes way down.
Right.
And that requires this courage to go out on a limb and assume there is value in admitting and assuming that there's something I don't know. There's something that I don't fully appreciate or understand. And I think that's something quite powerful and very transformative in some ways. And to me, the way you approach both of these stories really demonstrate and model this balance between courage and humility. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I think what's Slim is, I've been doing men's work for 11 or 12 years now, a lot of work. When I left the military, having a little bit of PTSD and some of that junk, that challenge, that I've been peeling this onion for a long time. And yet I tell these two stories, and today, like the last couple of days, I realize again, challenges that I wasn't even aware of at this point. Help me see or think through. Even I just think it's the irony of Cedric standing up for me and me not standing. I had never even made that connection at this point. Going, wow. Or not being the one to hear Chris, to think that, and I think we think that way. We think that an aspiring emotion is love. So if I can love this man unconditionally, even though I don't understand him, okay, I think that's a nice step. But it isn't truly what Chris could have used or wanted. It's like empathy is even like a further place. What I didn't do is become vulnerable. I was willing to love, push love, but I wasn't willing to become vulnerable myself to understand where he was coming from, to feel his pain.
Yeah. This is why I think I personally believe it's so important to start from a place where we recognize that empathy is something that we develop until the day we die.
Yeah.
And you remind me of this wonderful analogy that a child psychologist that I interviewed a long time ago mentioned on the topic of empathy. He defined maturation in a very interesting way. And he basically painted a picture of a baby where the baby is in the womb and the smell, the sensation, even the sound of what it's like to be in the mother's womb defines the entirety of the baby's world. But then when the baby comes out of the womb, the baby has to start to adapt to this whole new environment full of uncertainties, full of things that, is completely unknown to the baby. Yet unless the baby can adapt, the baby's survival is in threat, right? And the way in which the psychologists painted the picture was, for example, when a baby hears a footstep, it's very natural for the baby to assume that it's going to be mother that's going to show up, because once again, mother is the entirety of the baby's world. But there will inevitably be a time when the baby hears a footstep and somebody other than mother shows up. And this is, for a baby, a profound moment of transformation, because is that moment the baby starts to understand the idea of nuance and subtlety, where the baby can, even at a very young age, start to reflect, do you mean there are multiple types of footsteps? Yeah. That if I can pay greater attention, if I can, have this insatiable sense of humility, like we were saying, that I don't really know what a footstep is yet, I'm always open, then there are millions and billions of footsteps that I could potentially learn and discern. Right? And he said, this is what it means to mature. And I'm like, what? That can't be. I'm like, it just sounds so frivolous and simple. And he's like, but think about it. You only know you've matured when you look at something you thought you already knew, and yet you're able to make new meaning and value from it. Remember a book you read when you were 10 years old, and you read the same exact book 10 years later? Has it had a different meaning and value to you? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good sign. You're in the right direction. Yeah. And he said every single child that he's helped, and he's a child psychologist, inevitably comes back to him and has like a reunion of some sort. And so oftentimes they say, I used to think I knew who my mother or father was. And then over the years, who they are has continuously changed. And then he would once again say, that's just how things work. That's just how we as human beings mature. And I think there's a level of comfort in that. And there's also this the simplicity and the profundity of how we as human beings learn and mature. I just find there's something very fascinating and beautiful about that.
That's a really meaningful picture of that story. And I'm trying to do work on this pre-crisis leadership idea. But part of pre-crisis is being able to come in alignment or to grow or to be applicable or appropriate to what's being called for right now, because we're going to crisis, right? Yeah. That requires that classic growth mindset.
Right.
And when I hear you say that, it's like what calls up for me is, of course, to grow, we have to move away from fear, and that requires curiosity. And if I could embrace the idea that my world is constantly changing and be curious about what it's going to look like, right? Then I'm open to the opportunity to grow or change. And of course, the opposite of that is what we see in COVID and all the challenges we're having, right? We're fearful of what this new world's going to look like, and we want to return.
Of course, the normals.
We want to go back and pretend that
it never happened.
New footsteps are really mom's just
right. It was fine the way it was. Just have mom and her footsteps and nothing else. Exactly. Perfect stability and security and safety.
Right, but
I mean, I just can't repeat and emphasize this enough. The fact that someone coming with your background, especially the way you talked about the way in which things work in the military and the kind of esteem that's involved, I think it makes it extra difficult to be able to talk about things that are vulnerable. Right?
Oh, okay.
And the fact that you are willing to come on a show that's dedicated to embracing times in which where we've ourselves struggled, and the way we reflect back and reaping the lessons of our own instead of preaching to other people, hey, the lessons you should learn, which is a far more stable and secure and safe way to be, mind you. That really means a lot, Pierre. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Slim. And the important part that I learned even in this moment of the show is it was a gift for me to be able to talk about my stuff, to allow me to, let's say, process it a little bit more, to understand it a little, to be curious, and to all of a sudden have these new realizations that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't taken on the chance. So maybe it would, when you offered it up, it was a chance to talk about something. But now that I've gone through it, I've had the opportunity to learn and grow from it. So thank you. It's really good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to say before we end our show today?
No, I just am excited that, one, that you're doing this. I loved the idea of realized empathy, and I probably need to ultimately read your book and keep. Yeah. So, no, I'm serious though. I think it's an inspiring virtue.
Thank you. And I think it's one of those things where we as human beings, when we go through this and then we come out the other end, having had that realization, and we look back and what you said, appreciate it as a gift that has happened to us, as opposed to merely a painful memory. I think there is something to that and the growth and maturation that we talked about today. So that's a wonderful way to wrap up the show. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Slim. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, listener. Thank you for listening to the very end. I believe we can mature and innovate by navigating the difficult journey of realizing empathy in the face of tension. What I've learned from my own experience is that all of our challenges in empathizing with others is ultimately an opportunity to realize empathy with ourselves, to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of who we are and who we can be when we feel connected. And this journey is difficult. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is especially so if you go at it alone. So I envision a world where each and every one of us, from the moment we're born until the day we die, can feel certain there's at least one person we can reach out to at any given moment who can and will support us in this journey in a way that actually makes us feel supported. If you share this belief, please subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and also like and share this episode, as well as leave a review of our podcast so more people can enjoy it. And if you believe you know somebody who can be a great guest for our show, please send us email at podcast@realizingempathy.com. We absolutely love hearing from you. Thank you once again, and until next time, may you stay beautiful.